When was the last time a British king personally led troops into battle? Not watching from a hill, not commanding from the rear, actually charging forward on horseback, sword drawn, enemy bullets flying past, leading from the absolute front like a medieval warrior king. The answer, June 27th, 1743, the Battle of Dettingen. And the king was George II, 60 years old, fighting on foot after his horse bolted, leading British infantry in a bayonet charge against French cavalry. It was the last time a reigning British monarch would ever do such a thing. This is Dettingen, and what you're about to discover will show you a side of kingship that vanished after this battle, when monarchs were warriors, not figureheads. When a king's duty wasn't speeches and ceremonies, but leading men into gunfire and proving royal blood meant something on the battlefield. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're solving a mystery. How did a 60-year-old king, trapped in an impossible position, lead a trapped army to victory? And why did this battle mark the end of an era of warrior kings? Let's start with the first question. And if you're enjoying this investigation into forgotten British triumphs, make sure you're subscribed. We've got dozens more battles to uncover, each one proving English courage under impossible odds. Question 1. Why was a British king fighting in Germany? June 1743. Bavaria, Germany. Why was King George II of Great Britain commanding an army in the middle of Europe? Because George wasn't just King of Britain, he was also Elector of Hanover, a German prince ruling territory in the Holy Roman Empire. And Hanover was threatened. The War of Austrian Succession had engulfed Europe since 1740. France, Spain, Prussia, and Bavaria formed one alliance. Britain, Austria, and the Dutch Republic formed another. It was a typical 18th century dynastic war. Complicated alliances, territorial disputes, battles across multiple continents, and armies marching across Europe, settling royal inheritance questions through gunpowder and blood. George II cared deeply about Hanover. It was his homeland, his patrimony, wealthier than Britain in some ways. The territory had belonged to his family for generations. When French armies threatened Hanover in 1743, George did something extraordinary for a British monarch. He personally took command of the Pragmatic Army, a coalition force of British, Hanoverian, Austrian, and Hessian troops, and marched to defend his German territory against French aggression. Think about this for a moment. You're the King of Britain. You're 60 years old. You could stay in London, send generals to command your armies, enjoy palaces and power safely. Instead, you sail to the continent, take personal command of 40,000 men, and march toward a French army eager to kill you. Would you do it? Or would you let others fight while you stayed safe? Drop your thoughts in the comments. George marched east into Bavaria in May 1743, linking up with Austrian forces. The plan was to pressure Bavaria, France's ally, and threaten French supply lines. It worked too well. The French commander, Marshal Noailles, decided to trap George's army and destroy it. Capturing or killing the King of Britain himself would end the war instantly. Question 2. How do you trap an army? Late June 1743. George's Pragmatic Army marched along the north bank of the main river near the village of Dettingen. About 40,000 men, British redcoats, Hanoverian infantry, Austrian cavalry, Hessian auxiliaries, strung out along a narrow road with the river on their right and thick forests on their left. Marshal Noailles saw his opportunity. The pragmatic army was exposed, stretched thin, moving through confined terrain. Noailles positioned 35,000 French troops to execute a perfect trap. The French plan: block the road ahead with a strong force under Duc de Gramont. Position artillery on hills overlooking the road. Use cavalry to threaten flanks. Catch the pragmatic army in a killing zone, trapped between French forces ahead, river behind, forest blocking escape. It was textbook 18th century warfare. The French had position, numbers, artillery advantage, and the element of surprise. George's army was strung out, couldn't deploy properly, couldn't retreat across the river quickly. They were caught. George's officers recognized the trap immediately. The army was vulnerable. The king himself was in mortal danger. They urged George to withdraw, to pull back across the main river while they still could, to save the army and the king's life. George refused. He would fight, here, now, against a French army that outnumbered him and held every tactical advantage. The French had done everything right, except account for one variable: their enemy king's refusal to act rationally when honor was challenged. Question 3. What happens when your commander disobeys orders? Marshal Noailles had given explicit orders to Duc de Gramont, commanding the French blocking force. Hold your position. Let the enemy advance into the killing zone. Use artillery to shatter them. Force them to retreat into the river or surrender. Simple, disciplined, certain to work. Gramont disobeyed. Around 8 a.m. on June 27th, as the pragmatic army began deploying from marching column into battle lines, vulnerable, disorganized, perfect targets, Gramont decided the moment was right to attack. Not wait. Not let artillery do the work. Attack immediately with infantry and cavalry. Why? Pride, arrogance. The belief that French infantry and cavalry could crush the pragmatic army through aggressive assault rather than patient siege. Gramont looked at British and Hanoverian troops struggling to form ranks and thought, why wait? We outnumber them. We'll drive them into the river and capture their king. So he attacked, without Noailles' permission, against explicit orders, throwing away the perfect trap through sheer impatience. The French infantry and cavalry charged forward across the plain toward the pragmatic army. It should have been devastating, catching the enemy while deploying, vulnerable and disorganized. And for a few minutes, it nearly worked. British and Hanoverian units scrambled to form defensive lines as French columns bore down on them. But the French attack had a fatal flaw. It abandoned position to attack across open ground under increasingly effective return fire. And it gave the pragmatic army something they desperately needed: time to deploy properly and fight on equal terms rather than being destroyed piecemeal. Gramont's impatience had just thrown away France's perfect trap. Question 4. How does a king fight when his horse runs away? The battle was chaos. French infantry and cavalry charging. Pragmatic army units forming battle lines under fire. Artillery from both sides thundering. Thousands of men in red, white and blue uniforms struggling to kill each other across a smoky plain. And in the middle of it all, King George II, mounted on his war horse, personally directing troops. Then his horse bolted. 18th century war horses were trained for battle, but even trained horses panic under artillery fire. George's horse, terrified by the thunder of guns and screaming of wounded, broke control and galloped toward the rear. George fought to control it, pulling reins, spurring, trying to turn it back toward the fighting. The horse refused. Officers rushed forward to help. Soldiers watched their king struggling with a panicked animal while French cavalry approached. It was humiliating, dangerous, the sort of moment that could break an army's morale. Seeing their commander out of control, being carried away from the fight. George dismounted. He was 60 years old, wearing a heavy uniform, surrounded by battle, and his horse had just abandoned him. Most generals would have taken this as a sign to command from the rear. George drew his sword and walked forward on foot toward the British infantry line. "Now, boys, now for the honor of England," he reportedly shouted. "Fire and behave brave, and the French will soon run." He positioned himself with the infantry, not behind them, with them. A 60-year-old king standing in line with common soldiers, sword in hand, as French cavalry charged toward their position. His men saw their king refuse to abandon them, and something changed in that moment. This wasn't just another battle. This was personal. Question 5. Can infantry defeat cavalry in open ground? The tactical question of 18th century warfare. Could infantry hold against cavalry charges in open terrain? Conventional wisdom said no. Cavalry were shock troops, fast, mobile, psychologically terrifying. Infantry caught in the open would break under a cavalry charge. That's why infantry fought in defensive squares or behind protective obstacles. But George's infantry had no time to form squares. They were in line formation, 2 or 3 ranks deep, facing French cavalry thundering toward them at full gallop. And they were about to prove that British infantry discipline was worth more than tactical advantages or numerical superiority. The British infantry held their fire with iron discipline. Officers screamed at men not to shoot until the order came. Muskets were loaded and ready, bayonets fixed. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, watching cavalry approach at terrifying speed. The temptation to fire early, to shoot at maximum range and hope for the best, was overwhelming. Early fire would wound horses, but wouldn't stop the charge. The infantry had to wait. "Hold fire!" The British line erupted. Hundreds of muskets fired in perfect volley. At 40 yards, every shot told. Horses fell screaming. Riders tumbled to the ground. The cavalry charge staggered under the devastating impact. The front rank of infantry knelt. The second rank fired. Another devastating volley into the confused mass of cavalry trying desperately to reform. Then the British infantry charged with bayonets. This wasn't supposed to happen. Infantry charged cavalry. It violated every tactical doctrine. But British infantry, trained to fire disciplined volleys and trust their bayonets absolutely, didn't know they were supposed to be afraid. They saw wounded cavalry struggling to organize and attacked with ferocious determination. The French cavalry broke. They retreated across the plain, pursued by cheering British infantry who'd just achieved the impossible, defeating cavalry in open combat through nothing but discipline and courage. Question 6. Why do French infantry keep advancing? French infantry, white-coated soldiers in perfect formations, advanced toward British lines. Professional soldiers marching in step, colours flying, drums beating. They marched into the most disciplined musket fire in Europe. British volleys tore into them. Men fell by dozens. Officers died. The formations wavered, but closed ranks and kept advancing. This was 18th century combat at its most brutal. No cover. Two lines standing 50 yards apart, firing until one broke. British discipline held marginally better. British soldiers fired faster, maintained formation more consistently. After an hour, French infantry withdrew in good order, not defeated through cowardice, defeated because in that specific moment, on that specific ground, British discipline proved marginally superior. The French had fought with tremendous courage, but courage alone wasn't enough. Question 7. What makes this battle different from every other? Thousands of battles have been fought across European history. Most are forgotten, studied only by specialists. Dettingen is remembered not because of casualties or strategic importance, but because of one unique fact. It was the last time a reigning British monarch personally led troops in battle. After June 27, 1743, no king or queen of Britain would ever do what George II did, command from horseback or on foot, expose themselves to enemy fire, lead charges, risk capture or death on the battlefield. Why? What changed after Dettingen? Partly, it was the evolution of warfare. Battles were becoming larger, more complex, requiring commanders to control thousands of men across miles of terrain. Personal heroism wasn't as important as strategic thinking. Kings on battlefields were liabilities. Their capture or death could end wars disastrously. Partly, it was changing political structures. George II was one of the last warrior kings, raised in a tradition where princes learned war before statecraft. His successors, George III, George IV, William IV, Victoria, were ceremonial monarchs, not military commanders. British power rested with Parliament and professional generals, not royal leadership. But mostly, it was because Dettingen proved that kings on battlefields were anachronisms. George had fought bravely, won his battle, and returned to Britain as a hero. But military professionals recognized that the king's presence had been symbolic more than strategic. The battle was won by disciplined British infantry and poor French tactical decisions, not because the king personally swung a sword. What makes Dettingen different? It's the end of an era, the last gasp of medieval warrior kingship. After this, British monarchs would send armies to war, but never again lead them personally. The age of kings as warriors died at Dettingen. The age of kings as symbols was born. Question 8. Did George II actually win through skill or luck? Honest question. Was Dettingen a brilliant British victory or a French gift through incompetence? Arguments for British skill. Disciplined infantry fire shattered French attacks repeatedly. British troops held formation under intense pressure. George's personal leadership inspired confidence throughout ranks. British cavalry protected flanks effectively during chaos. Artillery was well positioned and devastatingly effective. Arguments for French incompetence. Gramont disobeyed explicit orders and abandoned strong position. French attacked across open ground against fortified enemy. French cavalry charged without proper infantry support. French infantry advanced into obvious killing zones repeatedly. Noailles' perfect trap was completely wasted by subordinates' impatience. The truth is both. British discipline and courage won the firefight, but they won because French tactical blunders put them in position to fight on equal terms instead of being destroyed piecemeal. George II deserves credit for keeping his army steady, for personal bravery that inspired troops, for refusing to panic when surrounded. But he also benefited from Gramont's impatience throwing away French advantages. Did George win through skill or luck? Both, like most victories. Skill kept the army fighting effectively. Luck gave them the chance to fight on favorable terms rather than being slaughtered in Noailles' trap. Question 9. What would have happened if George II had been captured? Final question. The biggest what-if of Dettingen. June 27, 1743. George II, King of Great Britain and Elector of Hanover, fighting on foot with his infantry. French cavalry are attacking. A stray musket ball, a lucky cavalry sabre strike, a random cannonball. George could easily have been killed or captured. What if the French had captured King George II alive? Immediate consequences. Britain's government would have faced unprecedented crisis. How do you negotiate when your king is a French prisoner? Does Parliament continue the war? Do they offer massive ransom? Does succession pass to George's son Frederick while the king lives in captivity? Dynastic chaos. George's relationship with his son Frederick was terrible. They hated each other. Frederick would likely have seized power, possibly refusing to ransom his father. British royal family would have torn itself apart publicly. War of Austrian Succession. With Britain's king captured, the pragmatic army would have collapsed. France would dominate the war's continental theatre. Austria might have sued for peace on disadvantageous terms. French hegemony over Europe would be confirmed. British political evolution. Parliament would have been forced to govern without the king. Constitutional questions about sovereignty, executive power, and royal authority would have been confronted decades earlier than historically happened. But none of this happened. George fought. His infantry held. The French were repulsed. He returned to Britain as a hero and lived another 17 years, dying peacefully in his palace in 1760. Britain's constitutional crisis was avoided. The Hanoverian succession continued uninterrupted. Parliament never had to govern without the crown. The disaster that could have reshaped British history simply never occurred. That's what makes Dettingen important. Not what happened, but what almost happened. One old king's refusal to act sensibly when trapped nearly changed British history fundamentally. One stray musket ball could have triggered constitutional chaos. One successful French cavalry charge could have captured a king and altered the course of empire. How did George II survive? Through British infantry discipline, French tactical incompetence, and sheer bloody-minded courage from a 60-year-old man who refused to let his horse's panic dictate his honor. He survived because when faced with the choice between safety and duty, between retreat and honor, between life and legacy, he chose to stand with his men and fight. That's the final answer to our mystery. George II won at Dettingen, not through brilliant strategy, but through the English virtue of standing firm when retreat made sense, of fighting when trapped, of leading from the front when safety beckoned from the rear, of proving that kingship meant something more than wearing a crown. It meant standing with your soldiers when death was staring you in the face. It's the last time a British king would do something that foolishly brave. And perhaps that's why we don't celebrate Dettingen more. Because we're secretly embarrassed that our monarchs once risked their lives so recklessly for honor and glory, instead of the careful ceremonial distance modern royalty maintains. If this investigation showed you a forgotten side of British monarchy, when kings were warriors leading from the front, not just symbols waving from palace balconies, then you know what to do. Subscribe and join us as we uncover more battles that defined English courage under impossible odds. What other forgotten English triumphs should we investigate? The victories that built Britain but have been lost to time. Drop your suggestions in the comments below. Thank you for watching Britain's History, where we don't just tell you dates and tactics. We show you why English courage and English discipline changed the world forever.